Hello, bonsai friends. This is Evan Pardue of Underhill Bonsai, and welcome to episode 28 of Little Things for Bonsai People, the podcast. And this time I am joined by Carmen Leskoviansky. How you doing, Carmen?
Hello. I'm okay. It's been a week.
Yeah. We can get into the weather and what we've been working
Oh yeah,
on in just
all
a
the
moment.
details.
Today, me and Carmen will be discussing azaleas and her work over at the University of Michigan and the bonsai collection there. And, just care, how to develop them, different varieties, suitable forms and shapes, and other things that, I don't know a whole lot. So I'm going to just be very open about that. I'm sure Carmen's going to give us plenty of good information today. Uh, but yeah, before we get started, I do need to mention that our podcast is sponsored by our amazing patrons over off of patreon.com. Starting the list with Tori Solis, Warehouse Rat, Boyd Snellgrove, Ricky Ruins, Joshua Bentley, Snappy Chappers, Ryan Gliando, sorry, dude, Joel Jenkins, Justin Knight, Backyard Bonsai Australia, The Ladies at the Flower Market, Taylor Peacock, Chase Pertweet, and then Vicky Off. She was formerly a $1 patron, but she upgraded to a bonsai bud. Thank you very much,
Woohoo.
Vicky. Welcome to the welcome to our little crew of bonsai best buds. And then a new $1 tier patron, David In. Thank you so much for being best buds and supporting our show. Everything helps. And just before we get into it, I do need to mention our editor Matt O'Donnell. Makes us sound awesome, makes us sound smart, cleans up our voices, makes it nice and smooth, kind of like an NPR show, kind of like how we joke around that Carmen's got the NPR voice. Uh, but he's a bass player and music player from Nashville, Tennessee. You can go check out his website at mattodonnell.com, or you can go to his Instagram. Same thing, Matt O'Donnell on Instagram. He has a contact form if you want some audio engineering work. You can go check it out there. He has a contact form on his website. So, so azaleas. I don't even know where to start because, like I had mentioned a moment ago, it's something I'm kind of ignorant to. We have some Satsuki azaleas, what we talked about earlier. I was saying Satsuki, which is kind of the way it's spelled, but give us a little light summary of Satsuki azaleas and other varieties.
Sure, yeah. So Satsuki azaleas are it's funny that you mention your pronunciation of it because I think most people when they see the word it's spelled Satsuki, right? But like a lot of the Japanese words, it's pronounced a little bit differently than it's spelled. So it is pronounced Satsuki. And it means fifth month, which is generally when these azaleas bloom over in Japan. So the month of May, which we're in right now.
Mm,
And
perfect
then,
timing.
yeah, exactly. So over in the States, they tend to bloom a little bit later. We're starting to see a few blooms here in Portland right now. Over in Michigan, at the university there where I have my other job. Usually we don't start seeing blooms till June, early June, usually more towards mid June, just because we're a little bit colder there. So they're a little bit further behind once you get over into the cooler climates. But yeah, I think they're a really cool plant. And I think that there's enough differences in growing azaleas that people tend to get a little bit intimidated. You often hear that people say, "Oh, I've had a Satsuki. I totally killed it. They're too hard to grow." Even over in Japan, they're sometimes considered a category of their own in that you don't always see them in bonsai shows. You don't see a ton of them in the Kokofu books. They'll sometimes have their own shows. Um, and some people think they're too gaudy for bonsai, to which I
Mm,
say, like, come on.
mm,
I really like them because not only do they have flowers in the springtime, but they're a really versatile plant. You can really create kind of any shape you want out of them. And even when they're not in flower, they're semi-evergreen. So you have some kind of, color on them. They're green leaves all year long. So you always have a tree that looks interesting even when it's not in flower. So overall, I think they're a great plant. They're kind of like black pine in that once you learn, the methodology and what to do, they're not too complicated. They're pretty vigorous growers. Um, and they come in all shapes and colors. So really, you can do almost anything you want with an azalea.
So that is interesting to know that they would be put in their own category, completely separate
Mm-hmm.
from other bonsai material. I know there was a book that was printed by Stone Lantern. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was exclusively a Satsuki Azalea Bonsai and Growers Guide.
Mm-hmm.
That was translated over. I think it's currently out of print though, unfortunately. So it's a
I
little bit
think
more rare.
so. I can't remember the name of it either,
Um,
but
I
I
think
know.
it's literally just azaleas, like Satsuki azaleas for bonsai slash
Yeah.
growers guide. I think it's just that simple. I
Mm-hmm.
can look it up, and it's kind of like the other book I tried to suggest to our listeners to pick up, the bonsai styles of the world. It's just out of print. I'm like, oh geez,
It happens. You could
uh,
probably find it somewhere at a club or,
yeah,
online somewhere. But
yeah. Just be respectful of if you find a PDF. Just saying. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, but there are a couple of ways to find good information on Satsuki azaleas,
Mhm.
and I found that book to be kind of like the definitive guide, like an encyclopedia almost.
Mhm.
Because what I'm seeing is that they're not just doing Satskis as bonsai, but also just as like appreciation, like the bloom appreciation. So the plant can
Right.
be shaped whatever way, just to make it look more interesting, not necessarily within the confines of like a typical Japanese bonsai design. It's just to
Mhm.
get those branches out so you can see the blooms and line them up.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes, especially when you're thinking of them and when you're just thinking of the flower appreciation, that's where you see a lot of S curves in azaleas. Folks are just trying to grow them a little bit interesting, and then they'll have flower shows essentially rather than, a bonsai show with their bonsai azaleas. So they can go, yeah, there's a couple kinds of different categories for them, even within their own category of being an azalea.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think
yeah.
they're really cool, and I wish I had a better edge on them. I have a local hobbyist, and just azaleas. He's one of our bonsai buds, actually. Justin Knight asks us a lot of questions. He's always throwing the azalea questions there because he's the one that's attempting to do grafts and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so, and he was asking me how to make exposed root style
Mm-hmm.
Niagari azaleas, and like that could be simple, from what I've seen, just because of the
Mm-hmm.
way that roots grow, they're so dense. But
Mm-hmm.
I guess
Yeah.
before we get too far into like styles, now we have kind of an overview. Like we know that azaleas, evergreen, flowers, the obvious thing, but there is how many like varieties can you think of?
I have a book from Japan that I think has over 2,000 varieties of cultivated Satsuki. They're really easy to breed and cross, kind of like orchids, like there's just so many different color variations. You can just breed them together and get all kinds of crazy stuff. So I mean, people ask me to identify an azalea for them. Like, good luck. I don't know. If you don't know what the name is, like when you buy your azalea, write down the name and keep it somewhere you won't forget, because otherwise you're going to be looking through a 2000 cultivar book of Japanese azalea names.
Yeah, they even the flowers will have a lot of similarities between some of the cultivars. Like some of them are so
Mm-hmm.
strikingly similar, it's hard to even know. Like you said, unless you just know. Because like
Right.
sometimes the cultivar could just be had been like crossbred just in a particular part of Japan or
Mm-hmm.
some other part of the world, even. Because what so does Satsuki azaleas? This is a question. Do you know if they're they pertain to the mountain azaleas? Like true Satskis have to come from Japan, or is that not the
Yeah, I
case?
think it's I think it's a specific mountain azalea from Japan. I think that's where that one comes from specifically.
Yeah. And then they branched off onto
Mm-hmm.
other azaleas. And so for propagation, I mean, what our azaleas do that I've seen, this is
Mm-hmm.
down in southern Louisiana, flower pops out, flowers there for probably 2 weeks, maybe, before it
Mm-hmm.
kind of wilts, and then it turns into this big droopy mess, and you have to
Ugh.
pull.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you have to pull the petals will eventually fall off, but because how wet it is here, it's a little less attractive looking.
Hmm.
But I'm sure in drier climates they kind of just pop off, and then you get the hip, like the almost like
Yep.
a rose hip, but it's azalea hip, right? Is that what you would call
Hmm.
it?
Yeah, the ovary is usually what we refer to it to. But yeah, essentially it's just like a rose hip. It's the ovary of the flower that's turning into a seed.
And then that is the seed,
Hmm.
because I've never seen, from my experience, I've never seen an azalea just reproduce and then drop a seed and then you see a baby azalea pop up. Have you seen
Yeah.
that?
No, but that's because we always pull the flowers off. We
Okay.
always pull all the ovaries off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know, maybe it's just the cycle. Maybe there's not enough cool months in the year for Louisiana. I don't know what it's like in Michigan versus Portland as well. Is it possible to do that crossbreeding like that?
Yeah, totally. I think like with a lot of crossbreeding, you have to be really specific about it. Like I would, if you're planning to crossbreed something, I would go through with a paintbrush and like take your pollen and put it on your flower so that you have your exact cross. You are sure that it's pollinated, and then you have to like watch that seed, make sure that it matures. And once you harvest it and plant it out, then you can, grow all those seedlings. And I think people do it here in Portland. I don't know anybody in Michigan who does it, but I think that's just because there's not a lot of Michigan winters are a little bit rough for azaleas. They need a little bit more protection than they do like here in Portland. And then there's already so many varieties. I don't think a lot of people are bothering to play with it, but it definitely can be done.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that they struggle in different ranges. And so I
Mm-hmm.
guess that's kind of like let's kind of start from like a really particular care guide. Like let's say you just
Mm-hmm.
looked up online, you got that care guide. So
Yep.
what's their ideal zone from what you've seen?
So they do really well. I mean, if you think about where you see azaleas and rhododendrons native to North America, kind of in, the Appalachian range. So kind of like middle America, where you have kind of mild winters and warm, humid summers is really what they like. So they do well over here in Portland. They do well kind of in um, like the Carolinas, the Georgia area. So imagine weather kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Would
where you're going to be the
would
most successful.
would you say that's like zones 6 to 8,
I
maybe?
think so. I'm not up to date on my zones.
Yeah,
Um,
and the zones shifted recently too.
yeah, they did. Everything's getting a little bit warmer, which is unsettling.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and so for winters, they can freeze, but they don't really want to be like in a deep freeze and they don't want to be frozen solid for a long time. So if you're somewhere like in Michigan, what we've got at the university is a cold storage greenhouse that we keep above freezing, but we only heat it, just a bit so that it is just above freezing. So that they get that dormant period. So if you're where you are in Louisiana, I don't know if you're cold for long enough to really be able to,
Uh,
you know,
it's
do.
cold for probably like a week or two. Sometimes the weather has surprised us
Mm,
just recently. And I know it's the same for Portland as
yeah.
well, where it's just it'll get really cold and then during
Mm-hmm.
the the summer y'all have had like some really extreme heat.
Oh my God, yeah.
It's been the opposite for us. It's been just surprisingly long frigid winters. And so when we get drop down into like 15, 14 degrees, we haven't been taking sat skis
Hmm.
anywhere. But
Hmm.
now that we're starting to experience this cold, any valuable sat skis that we're trying to work on here, we might start cold framing them.
Yeah.
And that would be your suggestion.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think once you really get down past like into the 20s and teens, for like long periods of time, I wouldn't want to hold them, at those temperatures for, more than a couple days. We try to keep everything, at or around 32 or 35, somewhere between 32 and 42 really is kind of ideal for, a cold treatment without freezing through. But they can handle, a few cold nights. Just, you don't want them at zero
Mm-hmm.
for the entire winter exposed to the wind, because they do still have their leaves. So
Yeah, I did notice that up at the Curtigas garden that they're just in the greenhouse structure, not
mhm.
necessarily hot. They're just like more just
Yep, they
kind
just
of, yeah.
hang out protected from the wind and the direct snow and ice, and yeah, so a little bit warmer, a couple of degrees warmer for them in there.
And they're put on the ground.
Yep.
Is that kind of just a Satsuki just like kind of tip, or is that just because of storage space, or
A
I don't
lot
know.
of it's for storage space for our
Okay.
cold frames here. It's like we keep a lot of our Satskis are still kind of in development. So those trees tend to end up on the ground over winter rather than up on a bench where a lot of our like, kind of finished trees go up on the bench.
Mhm.
Um, but in general, keeping things on the ground in the winter keeps them from freezing through as quickly as if they were, up on the bench, because the ground here doesn't really freeze. So it's that heat from the earth is kind of keeping that with in contact with the bottom of the pot and kind of overall keeping the plant, a little bit warmer than if it were up on a bench and the whole, pot and tree were surrounded by, whatever cold air temperature we have at the time.
Yeah. So placement for then we're talking mostly like environmental changes during seasonal times of the year right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always good to know. I feel like that's something that I think we talk about this on our podcast about just generally across a lot of other species and trees that we talk about. It's like we always bring up like the fact that the winter and the summer are most important.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that you're starting to feel like that?
For climate
Yeah, climate
control, I
stuff
mean,
is
that's usually when you have the most, drastic variation. In winter you can be at 32 or you can drop to below zero. And same within the summer, you can be, at 85 for most of the time, but then you get 110 for a week, so it's like those really drastic shifts, I think, are the most dangerous moments for our trees. So probably that's, when you have to be the most careful. Um, Spring and fall tends, I think, to be a little bit. I mean, the weather's wonky, like it's changing and it's different, but usually your temperature extremes aren't so crazy. So it feels a little bit safer to me, those seasons. So really, yeah, for azaleas and a lot of the trees, you're looking at how are you protecting them in the winter from those extremes, and how are you positioning them in the summer to maximize growth, but protecting them from, extreme heat or too much sun or too much shade. So, yeah.
mhm. Yeah, because I feel like as time goes on, I mean, we're just gonna need to talk about that more and more. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and so that kind of covers like the general, like how to, I'd say general too much. I always think about how much your mother when you say that. But the overall kind of treatment of them throughout the year. So if it's like growing season, are they a full sun or partial shade?
We usually do partial shade. Right now, I mean, it's springtime. We're not really into our super sunny season. We're about to put shade cloth up. Usually we do that sometime in May or at the very latest early June. Usually about now is when we start getting our shade cloth up, and they usually sit under 40 or 50% shade through most of the growing season. But in the early spring and in the fall, they're in, full sun. But the and I they can be in full sun if you are good with your watering, if it's full sun but not necessarily like in a lot of heat. I just recommend partial shade, especially when there's flowers on them, because the flowers can get not necessarily sunburned, but they can wilt, a lot easier if they're in the sun. They don't last as long when they're in the sun. So a little bit of shade goes a long way for improving um, flower longevity on your plants.
Yeah, I feel like we're gonna have to talk about the flowers
Oh yeah.
and before we get there though, because I was like thinking that's gonna be its own thing. I maybe let's kind of talk about like the repotting of them, because I know
Mm-hmm.
you're supposed to repot them after they're done blooming.
Mm,
is that okay? So there we go. That's one of those challenges. That's a challenging question there. That's the
yeah.
that's the rule, the like the rule that you hear in a lot of bonsai
Mhm.
books, and a lot of the older bonsai club members I've heard that been
Mhm.
said. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a really good way to kill your tree if you're not
Interesting.
experienced. Because if you're repotting a tree in June or July when it's hot and sunny and you're not doing any kind of defoliation and you're not protecting it in a greenhouse or being really careful with your humidity, it's really easy to kill a tree in the summertime. Not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. We do a lot of our azalea repotting early. Here it's, we kind of do it along with our other stuff in February, March, sometimes earlier on in the repotting season. Even in Michigan, we do February, March. So when everything's still totally dormant, before things really start actively growing. Um, it's generally a little bit safer for the plant to do that. You can do it in the summertime, but if you're going to do that, a lot of times you do that with a lot of cutting back or defoliation. So your kind of top and bottom are a little bit more balanced. Sometimes, like what you do with a tropical. And then you have to be really careful about your humidity afterwards, making sure it's wet, but not, or, moist, but not soaking wet all the time. And you just have to really pay close attention to it. So, unless you really need to do it in the summertime, early on in repotting season is, a fine time to do it.
Okay, so let's not repot our azaleas during the summertime, or most things during the summertime. For that case, because I've heard a lot of other things about repotting season could happen during summer dormancy, but I
Mm,
feel like that's one of the most intense times.
it probably could, but I don't know. Again, it's like, I don't know that I'd recommend it unless you're going to, put your stuff into a really humid greenhouse and monitor it really carefully. Like,
You'll need one of
mm,
those greenhouses that like regulates temperature too, with like a
yeah,
cooling.
automatic misters, automatic vents, automatic temperature control. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, now we're talking really complex. It's kind of like
hmm
the it's
If
kind
you
of like
have a
that.
commercial greenhouse, then maybe I would consider it.
Yeah, it's like I hear this question sometimes that whenever I'm at the nursery here and someone's like, "Oh, well, I would really love to grow my bonsai inside," and I'm like,
Mm,
how much would you like to invest into an inside setup? Because we're
right.
talking about uh nice strong UV light,
hmm
airflow, humidity, talking about somewhere to let the water drain out. You
hmm
need fresh, I mean stagnant of how your inside of your home is. And we get to this
hmm
point where it's like, okay, so why don't you just grow it outside? It's free. you know? And so it's kind of like with
Yeah.
azaleas, it's like just
hmm
repot it during the early spring. It's free.
Yeah.
You don't have to
Why
have that
not?
commercial greenhouse.
hmm
So
hmm I mean, there is some the benefits I think of repotting it in the summertime though are if you do live in a really humid climate, um, and if you have a really vigorous plant and you're doing kind of a big cutback, it can really rejuvenate a plant in that kind of a situation. Um, but if you're just doing your standard repotting and you're a beginner, I definitely wouldn't go there right away. Like there could be a benefit to doing it, but as a rule, I personally would not.
okay. Well, I think naturally the next part about azaleas we're going to talk about are roots and that the
Mm-hmm.
weird way that they go into pots. I've heard some things about azalea roots being so thick that have to use drinking straws to water them. But before we get into that,
It sounds like it needs to be repotted.
yeah, I'm gonna mention our shout outs from for our social media pages real quick. If you've listened this far into the podcast, thank you so much. If you want to check out some more of our work, for Evan, it's going to be at the website underhillbonsai.com. I've written some articles there. There's a link to the store, to Underhill's nursery. We're located in Folsom, Louisiana. And then also we have a Facebook and Instagram under the same name. And if you want to come check out my personal stuff. I do a lot of posts about, I mean, all I do is bonsai. So go to Facebook. I've got a lot of bonsai work on there as well under Evan Pardue. For Carmen, she is one of the co-founders of the Purple Pot Society. It is the National Women's Bonsai Club. You can go check that out at purplepotsociety.org. And the membership here, how about you kind of describe the membership a little bit? Because I feel like I cut it short.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So our membership is $35 for the year, and you have access to our forum, our articles, all of the other information on the website. We are trying to do more, not in-person meetings, but some more virtual benefits. So virtual meetings with, women artists, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's coming along, and we'll be present at the ABS show in Denver this June.
Yeah, good and exciting news about that in just a moment. Right after Carmen, well, actually, let's just mention Becoming Bonsai on Instagram. That's Carmen's personal page. You got some stuff on there.
Page.
Yeah, some reels of like little things happening. Vivian the cat hanging out.
Oh yeah,
some good stuff on there. And then for Mike, he will be joining us in later episodes. Go over to kitsunebonsai.com. That is, I'm sorry, that is spelled KITSUNE, bonsai, BONSAI.com. Mike is a South Florida bonsai professional. He does a lot of work in the area. So you can go attend one of his workshops. You can have him work on your personal trees. He does excellent work, specializes in shohin. You can go over to Kitsune Bonsai on Instagram and see some of his tree progressions. He's built some beautiful shohin in a very short amount of time. He works with a lot of tropical plants. But yeah, the ABS show, we can talk about that for a second because I just remembered that it is relevant to this podcast because we've been bringing up the ABS show. That's the American Bonsai Society Learning Seminar. And so there's going to be a bonsai show there. And I submitted a tree of my own. It's a water elm. It was collected by Zach Smith. He's a Yamadori artist slash curator of native species here as well. He's out of the St. Francisville area in Louisiana. And we purchased the tree as just like a stump, and then I grew it out. Doug took part in it, the owner of Underhill, and we've built the tree into a big wild broom looking shape. It's a beautiful tree, and I submitted it to the show, and it got in. So
yay!
So yeah, I'm excited to say that I get to drive 20 hours.
Woohoo!
I get to drive 20 hours from Hammond, Louisiana to Denver, Colorado. I did drive 20 hours to the national show when I got my winged elm in 2 years ago to Rochester. 20 hours is fine.
That's fine.
Yeah. My wife is like, why don't we just box it up and ship it and then we could fly? I'm like, oh my God, no.
No, I don't think so.
That's a lot of work. Yeah, and we could probably do a whole episode about how to prep a tree leading up to a show as I experience it real time. Because it goes from that episode that me and you did earlier, we were like, show ready trees. What is this? What is that? What do you need to do? And now it's like, oh crap mode. Your tree got into a show. Now what? So that would be appropriate.
That'll be our next episode.
Probably.
Oh crap.
Yeah. I think, because Denver is from the time that this episode comes out, it would be, I think, 3 weeks away.
Oh my God. That's fast. Yeah. That's like, it's like in a month from now. So it'll be 3 weeks.
So this comes out the next week. So this will be probably out on the 9th to the 10th of May. So that's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Oh, it's about 4 months.
Okay. 4 weeks. You got a month.
Yeah, we got time. I just got to prep the tree, but so me and Carmen will both be there. Carmen will be part of the is it a panel for Purple Pot Society?
A panel on women in bonsai. Yeah, put on by Purple Pot Society. Ow, cat just bit me again. Yeah, she's mean. You're mean. Go away. Yeah, so I'll be there on the panel. So yeah, I guess you can come to ABS and bug me and Evan.
Yep.
Woo!
I'll be walking around bugging other people about their trees on display and probably is there a vendor area in this
Oh
one?
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
the
yeah.
vendor area, you probably catch me there just drooling
Oh
over
yeah.
all the other trees.
Mm-hmm.
I know I had a great time at the national show. The vendor area there was insane. There was so
Yeah,
much good material.
that's huge over there. Yeah,
Um,
I'm curious to. I love a vendor area.
and it might be bad for me because I am bringing my trailer with my tree. So
Oh, you have plenty of space to carry things home.
yeah, fingers crossed. I'll have my wife there to keep me in check though. So we'll see.
Oh, I
uh,
finally get to meet her! Yay!
yep. We mentioned that earlier. So yeah, it's gonna be a really good time. So yeah, ABS. That's the 8th, 9th, and 10th, I believe,
I think so.
of
Yeah.
June. Yep. So yeah, it's gonna be a great time. I don't want to linger on it too much. It's kind of just the anxiety that's building right now. But let's get back to
Just don't think
azaleas.
about it. Yeah, let's talk about weird azalea roots and feeding them with drinking straws.
Yeah. So there was I believe it. I don't know if this is a thing or not. I've only heard it from the mouth of another bonsai professional um, that you get azalea roots so dense sometimes, and you get them into a shallow pot, which the shallowest that they can go from what I've seen is about 3 inches is safe. You don't want to go much deep. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
shallower than that because of water table and root rot. Correct?
Yeah. Yeah, they tend to like a bit of a deeper pot. Most shrubs tend to like deeper pots. They have kind of a different root system than trees do. They're a little bit finer. Azalea roots in particular are super fine. So yeah, they like a little bit deeper of a pot.
Yeah, I can relate with my work with Yopon hollies.
Mm-hmm.
The little shrub, not
Yeah.
as showy as an azalea. Evergreen has a super dense root system. We're talking, we joke about it in repots whenever we're doing like the boxwoods and the azaleas and the Yopons. We're like,
Mm-hmm.
these are like Brillo pads,
Yeah.
like straight up, like they're so dense that you can't even you can't chopstick the soil in there.
No, no, those are ones you just kind of take a bread knife to and like saw off the edges and hope for the best.
A bread knife.
I've heard people use sawzall, but I had a volunteer once who's like bread knife, just like take off the set.
Wow, how sharp is your bread knife, dude?
Oh, pretty sharp,
Yeah. Yeah, that must be a pretty
pretty dense root ball.
yeah, like the serration on that bread knife is
Mm-hmm.
incredible.
Mm-hmm. Pretty intense.
Because from what I could imagine is what are those called? There's a saw that I use. It's in my tool bag. It's a little flip out saw. We were using them whenever I was up in Portland last time. They had the really fine teeth too. I went ahead and got myself one because I saw it and I was like, that's awesome. That was really good for cutting fine roots.
Oh
I
yeah,
think
that
it's
I think we used
KTS.
yeah, that one, and I think we used Silky too. Those are pretty good.
KTS folding
Yes.
saw. They're like little tiny saws. They're like 4 inches long at the most when they're folded. And then when they
Mm-hmm.
fold out, they got this really nice flexible blade. And then Silkies are your kind of go-to, your professional brand.
Mm-hmm.
Those are good for cutting thick root systems like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, the drinking straw thing was like you poke a hole in there and you have to like feed it water underneath the root system because it gets so dense that it won't accept water to a certain
Mm-hmm.
extent. Have you ever heard that before?
No, but I mean, I've heard of root systems getting so dense that that happens, but generally in those cases, the drinking straw is clever because usually what we do in those situations, I haven't done it with an azalea, but usually what we'll do in those situations with whatever other species is, we'll take a chopstick or tweezer or whatever, and essentially drill a hole, into the core of the tree, the core of the root mass, and then backfill with pumice or whatever so that there's some aeration just to get us through until we can repot at the next appropriate time. The other thing you can do if your tree isn't accepting really any water is stick it in a pan of water so it soaks up from the bottom and really kind of saturate the entire root mass, and that will help get water kind of moving back through. Once the whole thing is rehydrated, then you
Mm,
can generally get water through a little bit easier overall. But if you're having that much trouble getting water into your root system, you have to repot. So
Could you, if you're having a major issue, like let's say it's summertime and you're just like, oh no, I can't get this thing watered, and you're having to dunk it like every other day, it feels like,
mm-hmm.
is if it's manageable, is slip potting them out and then moving them into a slightly larger container and trying to not disturb the root system, would that be
I
effective?
think in that case, you might just risk running water over the edge of your root mass, and kind of out the side. Like it would go into the pot, but it would kind of run off the edge of the root ball and around rather than really sinking in. So I think in that case, your best bet would be to kind of go in with, if a drinking straw is what you have, I guess that could work. But yet kind of like drilling a hole or,
Mm,
multiple, kind of around the core of the root mass and creating, spaces in there for water to go.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and that's an interesting thing that you bring up there, and I didn't really think of it. That's why we do this podcast, because I mean
Mm-hmm.
we're talking bonsai, and we're just going to keep on bouncing these ideas back and forth. That if you got a really dense root system on a tree, and you think that the solution to like not having it struggle is just to bump that pot size up, if it dehydrates quick enough and you go to water, that water's naturally going to just bead off the top side of that really dense root system, and you're creating a new airspace for that water to travel to. And
Mm-hmm.
and then if you, especially if you increase the pot depth, then you have an even higher amount of drainage going on, and so you might even struggle even more to get that tree to hydrate. So
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like best case scenario is if you're struggling with a tree not staying wet enough, and you seem to have too much dryness through the summer, and you might need to go deep shade and just do the hydration methods that Carmen's mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, like it's like it's no matter how much you try, it seems like the other way, like the simplest way is the easiest answer to keeping those tight root balls hydrated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the other thing that we do with azaleas a lot of times in the springtime is, as opposed to repotting, it's not a replacement for repotting, but sometimes on the off years of when you're not repotting, since they have such fine roots and a lot of their feeder roots are right on the surface, a lot of times we'll go in and scrape off the moss, maybe go about a quarter of an inch down, just to kind of loosen up the top of that soil mass, and then put fresh Yamagoki. So that's the Japanese mountain moss. You can use shredded sphagnum as well, but for azaleas, they tend, with azaleas, the preferred thing is the Japanese mountain moss. But any of your shredded mosses on top, to kind of keep those roots a little bit more moist, and that often loosens things up a little bit so that you can get a little better water infiltration through the season. But yeah, they tend to need to be repotted a little bit more frequently than a lot of plants, a lot of the trees. If you have a healthy azalea, it could be every year, it could be every other year. Usually, it's more every 2 to 3 years. But we've have a couple in the yard here in Portland where we repotted them, not this past repotting season, but one year before. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of borderline that we probably could have repotted them again this year, but we'll probably wait till next year at this point. So they
And
can grow really, really fast and become really, really dense.
one of the things that you do to check to see if any bonsai needs to be repotted would be take the chopstick and see how much space you have as you poke into
Mm-hmm.
the root mass.
Yep.
That's definitively the same thing with the azaleas.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. And so, yeah, so you go kind of in the outer 1 inch, like between the 1 inch of soil just on the inside of the pot. You want the core, of your tree to be tight. You still want water to go into it, but you're really looking at that kind of outer edge of soil that would get replaced if your chopstick will not go in
Mm-hmm.
relatively easily. If it keeps getting stuck when you poke at it, then you do need a repot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of a light touch on just repotting bonsai trees across the board a little bit.
Yeah.
It's like
Mm-hmm.
some of these things can be applied to other species, but I feel like,
Mm-hmm.
is there any other species specific azalea things that we should know about repotting before we move on? Because there's one of the things I want to get into is pretty interesting with the flowers,
Yeah.
but was there anything else you could think of?
Yeah. So for repotting, again, traditionally they're repotted into Kanuma, which is a kind of
There we
soil.
go. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah, located in a very specific region of Japan called Kanuma. What do you know?
Yeah, just like
I've been there.
Akadama, it
There's
comes from
lots of
Akadama.
Kanuma. Um, and so that's a really that's a you don't have to grow your azaleas in Kanuma. I will say I've seen them grown in other things. I will also say that I have seen some of the best azaleas grown in Kanuma, and it seems to be kind of the easiest. It's kind of one of those like, okay, if you just want to grow an azalea and grow it well, just put it in Kanuma. It's kind of like a no-brainer. It's like an easy thing.
Well,
But
what's
it's
the balance of Kanuma?
what do you
Or
mean?
so is it all Kanuma?
100%. Mhm.
Okay. Oh wow.
Yep.
Oh,
Sometimes you'll use different grades. So sometimes you'll use bigger on the bottom and kind of go up to a smaller grade towards the top of the pot. That I've seen, but Kanuma is really good at holding water without getting soggy. So, and it's a little bit more acidic. Azaleas like acid. They've grown them in Kanuma in Japan for hundreds of years. It works really well. It's one of those tried and true methods. And then surface coverage on those with Yamagoki, so the Japanese mountain moss. Again, expensive. You can use sphagnum instead for a very similar result. But again, if you can afford, the Japanese products, I will say that
they're superior.
I in what I have seen anecdotally, yes, I don't have the science to back it up, and I'd love to see, breakdowns of what all these soils have in them and what's the difference between the mosses. But I will say I have also seen azaleas grown in deciduous mix in pumice, with a sphagnum topping, and they're just fine. So
I think that's one of the struggles with trying to recommend these more expensive quality soil particles, more expensive mosses, more expensive fertilizers, more expensive treatments. And that's just I know it's tough to sit here and say, oh, well, it could be done the other way. And it's kind of like you were saying, like you've seen good ones in regular soil mix using regular sphagnum, using, whatever treatments you're using.
Those are also grown by professionals, who've been growing bonsai for as long as I've been alive.
And it doesn't want to sound like for our listeners, especially those who are trying their hand at azaleas, that it's not impossible to grow azaleas in affordable mixes. Azaleas will grow in potting mix, like regular high acidic peat moss and pine bark for a certain amount of time, until the root system just eats the whole thing up. Any permanent soil mix will work. Kanuma, as far as what I can collect from what Carmen's trying to defend a little bit on, is like it's very ideal, but you don't. It's like the
no-brainer. It's like if you're gonna have one or two azaleas and you want to do them nicely, spend the extra $30 and get the bag of Kanuma. You know what I mean? Like, just get the bag of Kanuma.
I think that kind of clears it up too. Is like we're over here talking about like Kanuma, high quality, and then some of the listeners might be imagining like, how much is this stuff? Is it like
it's like a bag of Akadama, right? It's just just another thing you have to buy. It's another expense. But
and that's what I tell some practitioners I see as they get to that next level, and they're starting to get to that point where they're right on that edge. They're like, I'm doing this and that, but I feel like there's something missing. Maybe there's something I could do a little bit more or dip. I'm like soil particles, change it up a little bit. I promise you, it'll go a long way. So, and soils can be, that's down the line. That's a whole episode.
That's a whole podcast. Not just an episode. That's its own podcast.
It's like we talk about it for like a whole half a year or even more.
Yeah. It's going to have like 4 seasons just about soils. Like, oh God.
But soils are really fun though.
They are.
And I didn't have the pleasure to take like a soils class in college at college.
I don't know that I would call it a pleasure, but
It's a tedious class from what I can imagine. But
My professor was named Dr. Crumb, though, and I thought that was kind of appropriate.
oh my God, dude. It's
Dr.
like
Crumb teaching soils.
they're like I joke about how some of the names for people that I've met in Bonsai, their last names just sound like Harry Potter professors. There's just like two directly related, and that's another one. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
But anyway, yeah, the repotting, the soil, that's yeah,
Mhm.
we could go into that more if we get listener questions that want to deep dive into more other aspects of that. We could do some
I,
research, talk some more.
one other thing I'll mention is bare rooting. Like,
Ah, yeah, that is a good point.
yeah, generally you don't bare root an azalea unless you're like going from, a seedling or pre-bonsai into like a permanent bonsai mix, whatever. Like generally you don't, it's not a standard practice to bare root an azalea. Can an azalea be bare rooted? Yes, they can be bare rooted using a power washer, like they do in Japan before they ship them over to the US. They cannot have any soil particles on them. So they can be bare rooted. They can be bare rooted using the most abrasive tool in the entire world. But, like,
Hmm.
again, when you are doing bonsai in your home, generally you don't bare root
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
And like from what I've experienced with the Yopons, I think that's one of the more direct comparisons to the soil and root type is you can get those particles in there if you want to go in and reset that root ball to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Not like full on, like you said, bare root, but take out
Mm-hmm.
like cut back sections, like
Yep.
maybe do like a third every time you repot.
Mm-hmm.
Just cut them in like a good bit, introduce soil, and then the roots will grow back into it, and then go to the other side, cut back a
Yep.
little bit on that side, and then let it grow back again.
A lot like you would do with the Yamadori. So, you're trying to get that out of its field soil and into a good bonsai mix. You do a partial repot. You do half one year, half the other year, or a quarter here, a quarter there, during each repotting season until you're where you want to be.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
that's just good to do with a lot of other trees too that are shrub
Right.
like.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Something else that I can relate to Yopons, I'm sure could be relatable to azaleas as well. We're just doing like a half and half here. We're doing like Yopons and azaleas.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I see a Yopon that's got a super dense root system, we got root issues, and we hit a certain pocket and it's root rotted.
Pockets. Yeah.
Yep. You got one of the things that I was shown by a good friend of mine that been practicing bonsai for a long time. She turns the root ball over and smells it
Mm-hmm.
and looks for
Oh,
the root
yeah.
rot.
Ugh.
Yeah.
If it smells bad, it's root rot. If it's
And
black, it's root rot. Mm-hmm.
and you need to dig it out and excavate it
Oh,
all
yeah.
the way out,
Get all of it out of there. Yep.
and then it'll replace.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah,
Yep.
and yeah, I think that's more than enough coverage on repotting for azaleas. So let's talk about the show. So for azalea Satsuki azalea bonsai to show,
Mhm.
one of the things you see a lot with those trees is the flowers always look like they're lined up in rows. Can you
Mm-hmm.
tell us about that a little bit? Is that meticulously lining those buds up? Or how's that work?
So I personally haven't gone to that extreme with managing the bloom of them, but I have seen that done. And yeah, there is definitely something to it when you're pruning your azalea and when you're doing shoot selection. Um, Oftentimes what you want to do is make sure that your shoots, I mean, not only are lined up and everything, is aligned the same, orientation, but that you have enough space for each flower to fully open. Because if you don't, uh, your flowers just, I mean, they won't fully open. Your tree will still be, one giant mass of pink, but everything will be really cramped together. You won't see that full open flower like how you see them in show books. So, yeah, that's a lot of work to do.
So it's more removing the flowers to make them
Mhm.
appear lined up. You wouldn't say that they prune or wire.
I don't know. I will just say, yeah, I don't know that they go to that extreme. I wouldn't be surprised if they do.
It's just
The
like when you
farthest the
see,
farthest that I've gone here is just to thin out to the point where each flower can open.
yeah, because I know with some fruiting plants,
Mm.
they will do a selective, like like this is where you want this fruit to be, so we
Mhm.
cut this one off, or we.
I would not be surprised if that were the case because I do know like when you're even when you're wiring a pine, when you're laying out each of those tips, they have to be at the exact same angle or it looks messy. Like
Mm-hmm.
the detail that goes into finding the exact angle of orientation for that one little point, and then every other 500 of those points on the tree has to be
Straight.
exactly right. So I wouldn't put it past the folks who are photographing those azaleas professionally at that
Mm-hmm.
level. Yeah.
Yeah. And then after the flowers are done, at what point do you remove the hip? Like, so when it gets to that
Mm-hmm.
point, when the show's over, when I say show, I'm not referring to like we always put azaleas in the show. It's preferable to put them in a bonsai show in there and flower, but a show would be a like performance that the tree gives you for that season.
Mm-hmm. So
That's why I
just its
keep
bloom
saying that.
period. Yeah.
Yeah, blooming period would be called
It's
a
fancy
show.
show.
Yeah. So when do you remove the flower normally?
If we're letting a tree bloom, which is a whole other topic, then usually we take them off as they start to get wilty or mushy, um, or when you start to see them kind of pop off themselves. And usually at that point, when we remove the flower petals, we go in and pinch off the ovary as well so that, you're not really double handling that point on the tree. You're just going in one fell swoop and getting out that ovary and the flower at the same time.
Yeah, and when you cut back, there's sometimes a little stem connected to the base of the flower.
Mm-hmm.
Does that all come off as well?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going back to the branch. So
We're
we're the
going back to the whirl of leaves at the bottom.
okay, and
Yep.
that's another thing that I've seen in other bonsai articles and other discussions about azaleas is the branches do have a tendency to whirl.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
so
They're
when you have
whirly
a
twirly.
so
Sorry.
no, whenever you have a whirl, um, that could be beneficial, but also fight against you in bonsai development, branch refinement. Correct?
Mhm. Yeah, so a really healthy azalea can put out as many. I've seen like 7 shoots in a whirl before. I've also seen like 2, like it just depends on the azalea and how strong it is. But yeah, so generally, let's say you're at the point of your season where it's flowered, you've removed flowers and ovaries, and now you're left with all this new growth that it's pushed in the spring. And so this is the time where you go in and you do reduction of all your new growth. And we usually use a method that we call the fishtail. So that's taking your whirl of however many shoots you have, at the base of where that flower was, and taking it down to 2 of those, and then taking those 2 shoots and cutting each one of those back to 2 leaves.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of ends up looking like a fishtail. And so
Oh,
you do that. Yeah. So
I like that. Yeah.
back to two, essentially.
And it's
Uh,
this, is it the medium strength ones we go into?
Usually, what you want more so than medium strength is 2 that are about the same strength. So
Okay.
if you have, one really strong one, and if you have a couple really strong ones and a couple really weak ones, you have to make your decision as to if. But yeah, if you have medium strength ones on there, generally, yeah, you go for that.
Those
You're
are
trying to
ideal.
equalize the energy over the whole tree, like you do. I'll often compare them
Oh,
to like black pine. So usually with azaleas, you come in after you do all your black pine work. That's usually time for azalea work, and it's very similar where you're reducing that growth to try to equalize energy over your whole tree.
that's something that I totally forgot to mention when we were getting into azaleas is that they're one of the only species that we work with in bonsai that's basally dominant.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Mm-hmm.
So should that be a big concern to younger practitioners getting into azaleas? Should they be really worried about basal dominance? What does that mean for developing azalea?
Yeah, so basal dominance essentially means that instead of where a tree, holds all its strength kind of at the top, it's going to want to grow the top of itself strongest because it wants to get, tall and outgrow all the other trees around it so it can be dominant in, whatever forest it's in, right? So a shrub is more basally dominant, so the lowest branches on that tree are the strongest. So those are generally the ones you have to rein in a little bit more and generally leave a little bit more foliage towards the top. So it's a little bit opposite of what you would do with a tree. Just kind of leave your bottom branches a little bit weaker than your top branches.
Yeah, so thin balance them even more so on the bottom.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's it's very odd to, and that's almost like you have the subcategory when you work on your bonsai. You have your elms and your maples and stuff that are just so ridiculously top dominant. So you find yourself thinning those a lot more on the top, and you turn
Mm-hmm.
around to your azaleas, and it could be a little bit like mind warping a little bit. It's like, oh wait, I need to
Yeah, do the opposite.
reapproach this. Yeah. So that's what I need to get, at least one decent Satsuki or whatever kind of azalea, because there's a couple of other varieties out there of azaleas that are suitable for bonsai, but the Satsuki
Mm-hmm.
is kind of arguably the better because of the dwarf nature of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
Yeah.
yeah, we have a few here at the nursery that I get to trim back, but they're not really anything crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But but you have your fair share of them. So,
Yeah.
I think I think that without overdoing it too much on azaleas, I feel like there's still more to say.
Oh God,
Um,
yeah. We barely
and
scratched the surface.
exactly, we could probably do like this is just beginners basics
Mm-hmm.
of azaleas, and then maybe we'll later down the line be like, okay, let's do a more advanced visit of azaleas, because we did talk about some vaguely advanced stuff, but I feel like there's more to
Mm-hmm.
be had later on down the line.
Yeah.
And so we've been mixing in bonsai forms and styles series episodes, and then we haven't really done a species one yet. So I think this is a good start for azaleas.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, before we run too long, there was a single listener question that someone wanted to revisit on a double potting method, and then of course we have our bonsai word of the week. Um,
Could we finish out the seasonal year for the azalea though? Because we didn't touch on fall at all yet.
oh
Ah,
crap. Yep. See, there's
sorry.
more to it. Yep. So
There's more to
rat.
it. I can go real quick. I'll go real quick.
Okay. Yeah.
I didn't realize how much I could talk about azaleas, but
Oh, there's so much. Yeah.
yeah.
Like you said, they could be their own thing. Like someone could have a whole garden of just
Oh God.
azaleas. But yeah.
Speaking
Go
of,
ahead.
yeah. So we'll jump, yeah, just into fall real quick. So once you cut back into your fishtail method or whatever in the springtime, summertime, what it's going to do then is grow again. And so something to do in the fall is shoot reduction. So a lot of like what you do with your black pine in the fall, where you go in and whatever has grown, you go in and you reduce back to 2 shoots, whatever. Same with the azalea. You go kind of to each tip of each branch and make sure that there's just 2 new shoots there. And a lot of times what we'll do too is take out any of those old leaves just to, because they'll fall off naturally over the winter, but just to keep things a little bit cleaner. And to keep yourself busy, just go through and take out some of those old leaves. So
If you weren't busy enough.
right. So this is it's a busy tree. So if you have one azalea, that might be plenty. If you have 100 azaleas, you need a lot of help.
Yeah, you're running a bonsai garden
Yeah.
at that point.
Um,
Speaking of which, what do you feel good with the closeout on the fall there?
yeah.
Uh,
One other thing I'll touch on really quick is like 2
okay.
super common azalea diseases, and then I'll stop. I promise.
Okay, go ahead. No,
So
more's better.
we mentioned root rot, so that's something to watch out for in the roots. The other thing to watch out for is a flower fungus. I think it's called Avulinia. I should have double checked it, but it's in the springtime it'll turn your flowers mushy or put brown spots on them. So fungicide is like a really good thing to just do preventatively in the spring, kind of a regular thing until you're through bloom period. And then the one pest that I see a lot on azaleas is the lacewing bug. And so that likes to go on the underside of the azalea leaves and eat out all the chlorophyll. So if your leaves are looking kind of pale,
Mm.
or if you start to see, kind of a lacy texture on them, look underneath your leaves. And a lot of times you'll see a really cute little bug under there.
But it's not cute.
It's not that cute. So any
Yeah.
kind of insecticidal work on those. But those are two a pest and a disease to really watch out for on azaleas. Okay, I'm done now.
Yeah, it's okay. No, it's fine though because honestly though, with the listener question, I think we will probably hold up on it for Mike to kind of chime into. I feel like me, you, and Mike have talked about double pot a little
Hmm.
bit in the past, but we did have a question about what type of pots, what
Hmm.
timing, and why and how and stuff. We could probably just let Mike let it rip on like a whole episode about double potting because
Oh
he's
yeah.
he's given entire lectures that I've seen talking about double potting, putting collars on pots, like taking a piece of plastic or something to raise the level on the pot so it gets more drainage. And we're talking a lot of Shohin stuff too when he mentions that
Hmm.
method. A lot of interesting stuff there. So we'll revisit the listener question. I'm so sorry about the listener out there that was like, oh, here we go. And I'm like, nope, nope. You know what? We're in overtime.
Yay.
But no,
We'll come
this,
back to it.
yeah, we'll come back to it. There's so much bonsai stuff to talk about. I mean, that's
And if
just,
anybody wants more specifics on any of the Azalea stuff, just shoot us a message on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. And
yeah. And that'll be noted by next week. If you're
Mhm.
listening this far in, I'll mention it later on in a next episode. I'm going to create a Facebook page for little things. So go
Great.
follow us over there. I might even have the time to open up a Discord, and the Discord will include our Bonsai Best Buds. And so we can kind of swap questions there as well and critiques.
Hmm.
And I had a request for bonsai progression recommendations. And, it would be a lot of fun is if we got a listener uh, progression tree and someone started, we worked alongside with some progressions and saw how they evolve over the
Mm,
time they listen to the podcast and we help do those progressions. I think that would be really cool.
that'd be really cool.
Yeah. And so let's just move on to the bonsai word of the week. I was going to make it Satsuki, but I feel like
Hmm.
we just talked about Satsuki's for like an hour. So I think that's more than enough. So
Never enough.
my bonsai word of the week that I've chose to go with is I feel it's a word that I've talked about a little bit, and you hear me and Mike say it a lot. It's a word that I actually learned from Mike. Learning how to use this word will tell other bonsai folks who are also as serious that it'll make you sound a little bit smarter. Let's just say that.
Ooh.
So use this word at your next bonsai club meeting if you're looking at an exceptionally old bonsai. Say moche kome.
Oh, I love that word.
It's an amazing word. I feel like we touch on it every once in a while, but it hasn't had the limelight as the bonsai word of the week yet. So when you go to your bonsai club, bonsai garden, bonsai show, whatever, you're critiquing trees with your friends, and you look at this one tree and you're like, oh, that tree has an outstanding nabari. The texture, look, there's bark growing on the nabari. There's bark growing on the branches. The branches of this tree
Mm,
are clearly old. Like not only were they developed, but they have bark on them. They have texture. They have weight in the design. They feel like they've always been there. And
hmm.
that word mocha kome is an aesthetic of a tree that has truly been in cultivation as bonsai for much longer than we could probably just guess just by looking at it. Uh,
Hmm.
and not many bonsai have that appearance, but when you see one, it's undeniable. That's
Yeah.
that's called mochikome.
Hmm.
So,
Cool.
uh, what things like kind of stir up that feeling when you're looking at old bonsai too?
It's just this kind of feeling of ancientness. It's like it's been there forever. Um, it doesn't really look like it's been, had a lot of human interaction
Well,
recently, like it's just,
wasn't formed by humans.
yeah, it's just kind of, yeah, it's just this, like you said, it's always just been an old tree that's been like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Um, I feel like a lot of Yamadori, like old
Mhm.
collected trees, naturally just kind of induce that feeling. And then
Mhm.
when they've been realized and they've been developed and cared for properly, then that's whenever those trees hit hard. But whenever we have a tree that's a little bit more like a beech tree is a great example.
Mhm.
Like there's an outstanding beech at the Curtigas collection. Um, that's that big beech we worked on last season, right? Oh, no, it was a Stewardia.
Oh yeah, that was Stewardia.
I'm sorry. The
That's
smooth
okay.
bark
We have a
plant.
beach too.
Yeah, there is a beach, and I
Stewardia is
love that
nice and
beach. That one's a little bit more. That one does have the older age look to it, but the Stewardia
round.
is
Oh man.
surprisingly smooth,
Mm-hmm.
but it has qualities to it that still invoke old.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, those older features. I mean, and this is why we do bonsai. It's the viewing and the appreciation of the art of ancient. Uh, and so Nabari, mature branch structure, barked up branches that have older bark. Well refined pads, dense canopies, rounded tops. It used to be old school to have like pointy tops on bonsai.
Mm-hmm.
Now professionals have considered rounded tops to be old because old trees in nature have broad tops. And then, of course, other characteristics of that species that would tell you it's old, like junipers, dead wood features.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Good one for me, swamp cypress, flat top development,
Mm-hmm.
some kind of structure where it's dominantly on the top, but you can have lower branches, but the crown is much more broadened. Just like elm trees can kind of be represented that way too. I've seen a mixed bag for elms when it comes to showing
Mm-hmm.
an old age shape. But yeah, I could go on and on about how old trees can have this feeling. But yeah, I think that's it's a great word.
It's
Uh,
a great word. I just learned that word this year, actually. Earlier this, or maybe it was last year. But
mhm.
yeah, it's a relatively new word for me, and it was good to learn because I think I learned it in reference to Kusamono. And in Kusamono, you can see it where, versus something, an old planting that's matured, that's completely filled in, that's, it's grown so much that its own roots are kind of pushing itself up out of the pot. So it's created this mossy mound over something that's just been freshly potted, that hasn't filled in, that you can still see the soil. It's kind of, the plant is a little floppy because you can tell it was just put in the pot. So something that was kind of the reference in which I learned it, that word. But yeah, it's a good word to know. It's a really good word.
Yeah. And from the Kosamono standpoint, that's going to be plants that are like clearly established,
Mm-hmm.
like you're kind
Yep.
of saying, like established, and you can't tell how old or long the planting is.
Mm-hmm.
In Kosamono plantings, Mochikome on those plantings is, in my opinion, that's beautiful in a way that is not even close to how bonsai could be beautiful because Kosamono plantings get smaller leaves,
Mm-hmm.
more dense habits, just in plants that you would not expect to see. And
Mm-hmm.
you might take like a plant that normally would grow 5 feet tall, put it in a Kosamono planting, and it might do something that surprises you. And that's the fun in Kosamono plantings too.
Mm-hmm.
But we could talk about Kosamono on another episode
For sure.
before we get too far on that. But yeah, and then the one of the biggest influences on Mochikome is the wabi and the sabi bonsai. So uh, but we'll do wabi sabi as a bonsai word of the week later on because Mike has some really awesome insight on wabi sabi. He kind of built like his kitsune bonsai model around those words. So we'll revisit that one too. But that is a huge part in the Mochikome uh, view and poeticness that is that word. So, but anyway, yeah, we're coming to the tail end of the episode. This has been a really good outline of azaleas. I don't know if we've even said enough. I mean, like you were saying, I feel like there's so much more to it.
I could keep on going.
Yep. Yep. Oh, and we can wrap it up. Did you want to mention the show that's coming up in Michigan? I remember
Oh
we
yeah.
mentioned.
My other, so what I do now is I'm apprenticing with, Michael Hagedorn here at Crataegus, but before that, and still currently, I'm working with the University of Michigan, the Mathi Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum. It's where I started learning bonsai. It's where I'm going back to when I'm done here. And they're receiving a large collection of azaleas from a private donor. And this year marks the 10-year celebration of having our bonsai garden. So we've had bonsai there since the 1970s, but we've only had like a display garden for the bonsai for the last 10 years. And so we're receiving more trees as part of that donation this year. We're doing a big naming ceremony. The entire month of June will be focused on azaleas and bonsai out at the University of Michigan Botanical Gardens. So there's a lot of information online that we have for that, and maybe I can give you that in the show notes or something, Evan. But mbgna.umich.edu is our web address for that, and you can find a lot of bonsai information there. And yeah, so we've got a big collection of azaleas there. We're doing workshops. We've got a couple folks coming in from Japan to do some workshops with us.
What time? When is this? In June?
That's in June. So the week after Denver, the 16, 17, 18 is when we're having workshops.
Okay.
And like the formal naming ceremony. But the entire month of June, the garden will be open. We'll be featuring azaleas on Instagram, Facebook, the website, in person, all kinds of stuff. So
awesome.
Yeah, and we can talk more about it too on another episode, go into maybe some more details. But yeah, we can share some more stuff on our social media as well. So
yep. Awesome. Yeah. I've seen pictures of some of the trees in y'all's collection. You showed me the article that was in was that Bonsai Focus?
No, we had one in it was the ABS journal.
Yep.
Yeah, there's one recently in the ABS journal about the collection and all of that. So
yeah, some of the trees I saw just from what is there before the introduction of the newer trees, the trees there are outstanding.
Yeah,
I would love to maybe one day soon I'll have to go up there and check that collection out. I mean, I still got a lot more traveling to do. So
you want to practice with azaleas? I'll bring you in after blooming, and you can help take all the flowers off.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
So fun. Well, and also do the trimming and the fun part of it.
The bonsai practices.
The bonsai part of it, not just the flower.
Yeah,
sure.
So anyway, thanks for joining me on this one, Carmen. It's been,
for sure.
It's always a good time, and we will catch up with our listeners and our bonsai best buds on the next one. You guys have a good one.
Bye.